I think I have met most of you, but just as a matter of introduction, I am Brian Bott. I'm a principal scientist and community manager at Sage Bionetworks. Sage is a small nonprofit in Seattle, Washington, focused on promoting an ecosystem in all biomedical research where science is more open and transparent. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about work we've been doing over the past few years in mobile health. And so I think when most people think of mobile health or mHealth, you think of a smartphone and you think of likely tracking trends over time, usually some sort of activity, whether that be from a Fitbit or some other monitor. And that's all well and good. But what we're trying to focus on is how we sort of move beyond this insular health tracking where one individual is tracking one aspect of their health, possibly over time. So there's a huge opportunity here. There are nearly 200 million smartphone users in the US alone and well over 1 billion worldwide. And so a large proportion of those people are doing some sort of health tracking on their own without any sort of aggregation across them. I'm going to set the foundation here a little bit by a very interesting project that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation called the Health Data Exploration Project. And what the Health Data Exploration Project did, they reached out to individuals and asked them about their patterns of app usage and mobile tracking. And specifically in this case, they asked how do you share your PhD? And in this group, PhD has a little bit of a different connotation, but in the Health Data Exploration Project, PhD is your personal health data. And as you can see here, 60% said they share their personal health data with a friend. Just over half said they share it with their spouse or partner. As you can see, about a third, only about a third said they shared their personal health data that they were collecting on their own with a health professional. In contrast to that, they were also asked, would you be willing to share this personal health data with researchers? Almost nobody said they definitely would not or probably would not, and over 75% said they either probably would or definitely would share their health data with researchers. But as you know, it's also very important that information be kept anonymous. So of that same group who was asked if they would share their personal health data, well over 95% said they were at least somewhat, it was at least somewhat important that this health data be kept anonymous. So we have sort of this inherent tension here, and like to pose the question of how do we balance the desire of individuals to share with the importance of their privacy. And I think we're seeing this not just in health data, but with all sorts of data as we move into this digital age. So I sort of want to set the stage with that important question, and then we'll dive into a little bit more about the work we've been doing at Sage. So a little over a year ago, March 9th, 2015, while everybody was not so patiently awaiting the announcement of the Apple Watch, Apple at their developers conference last year announced the launch of something called Researchkit. It was an open source framework to enable people to quickly build research apps using the iPhone. And along with that platform, there were 5 apps that were announced at that launch. And I'll talk about those 5 in a little bit more detail, and one in quite a bit more detail. And what those 5 apps all shared, in fact, was a back-end solution, which is the bridge architecture within that was built at Sage Bionetworks. And so of the apps, you can see above, one is a Parkinson's disease study, which was run at Sage. There's an asthma study that was run at Mount Sinai School of Medicine, cardio study out of Stanford, a diabetes study, a glucose study at MGH, and a breast cancer survivorship study also run at Sage Bionetworks. And so there are sort of three components here. One is a consistent consent process across these 5 apps, which I'll talk a little bit about. A data hosting a set of APIs that each of the apps was able to talk to, which was Bridge. And what Bridge did is it essentially was a mechanism for the apps to separate out the personal account information that goes along with each study's participant. So that is, email address, their account, their password, and other possibly sensitive information. And then what it did in response was dole out health codes that then were used to encode all of the actual research data. And then that research data each evening is exported, encoded without personal identified information to Synapse for the study research teams to start working on. And so the first of these components, and I think very much at the core of how we get around, or at least start to educate those that are participating in these studies, is the concept of a participant-centered consent process. And in contrast to a lot of current consents, which are oftentimes written by a doctor, reviewed by a lawyer, and then edited by a committee, they aren't necessarily rooted in actually informing individuals. And so we started a process where we tried to work on putting the informed back into the informed consent process. And we did that by using a lot of design elements that are ubiquitous with other technologies and other ways of trying to convey information. So we provided information in a tiered manner that can be accessed by participants, and I'll show you what that means here in a minute. The first tier is pictorial dominant, and then the second tier was text dominant. And at the tail end of the consent process, because we didn't have individuals sitting in front of, so usually when a consent process is done, there is somebody who's sitting down with the research participant, allowing them to ask questions if they have any, to really try and ensure that they understand what they're signing up for. So since this was being carried out on a mobile phone and remotely, while we did provide contact information, if people did have questions, we also required that they have a perfect score on a short assessment to make sure that a lot of sort of the key elements were understood by the participants before they could actually enroll in the study. And so here is an example of one of the many screens during the consent process that people would go through. So you can see there is one picture that is front and center that tries to convey the general theme that we want people to think about on this slide. In this case, it's a hand saying, "Wait a minute, let's think about this." There is a short text blurb, risked privacy, and a subheader saying, "We'll make every effort to protect your information, but total anonymity cannot be guaranteed." And then there is a second, much more text-heavy layer, which is available on every one of these screens, which is a learn more screen, such that people, if they're interested, can learn more beyond just sort of that short blurb. And at the end of the day, what this boils down to is our belief that it's more important to be radically honest with research participants as opposed to being radically restrictive on what is done with the data at the tail end. We're living in an age where digital bits float around quite a lot. And while we certainly practice security best practices, encryption, end-to-end, et cetera, I think it's important to be upfront with people and such that they realize that there is some inherent risk, even if it is minor, as opposed to trying to make them feel overly comfortable in a situation where we may not be able to completely guarantee anonymity in these cases. The other thing we did at the tail end of the consent process is after they consented to the study, we actually gave them an option of how they could have their study data shared. And so people were presented with, and this was the case across all of those initial 5 apps, people could choose to share their data only with the study sponsors, in this case, Sage, Bionetworks, and our partners, or they could choose to share their data with the study team as well as qualified researchers worldwide. And again, this is an attempt to balance the security settings of the system with the desires of those being studied. And actually what we saw in the first 6 months, there were over 75,000 participants across all 5 of these studies. That gives you a sense of scale. And over 70% opted to share broadly. So they opted to share not just with the individual research teams, but in fact to share with other qualified researchers worldwide, mirroring quite closely what was seen in that health data exploration survey that was carried out a couple of years ago. And so this sort of sets the larger scape of what we have seen in mobile health. And what I'd like to do now is actually drill into one of these studies that we have been working on, and that is the Parkinson's disease study. The app is called Empower. And I'm going to focus on the first 6 months. We just eclipsed the year mark a couple of weeks ago. But you'll see why I'm focusing on the first 6 months shortly. So there were over 48,000 unique downloads from the App Store in those first 6 months. Just over 16,500 participants were consented. Just under 15,000 completed the enrollment process, which also included choosing sharing options, validating their email, et cetera. And of those, over 9,500 agreed to share broadly. And of those 9,500, there were over 1,000 who were self-reported as having a professional diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, with the remainder being controls that can be used for assessment of sort of a standard baseline. And why is it interesting to have a mobile app looking at Parkinson's disease? So these are some of the data streams. These are some of the activities that individuals were asked to complete. So there are a number of different symptoms that could be tracked remotely using the inherent sensors on the phone. So people were asked to do a tapping test to measure dexterity. So there were 2 buttons on the screen that people were asked to set the phone down on a flat surface and tap back and forth between those 2 buttons as fast as possible over the course of 30 seconds to see how many taps they can get. People were asked to do a short walking test where they would walk for 30 seconds, turn around, and stand still. So that was an assessment of both gait and balance. People were also asked to say "ah" into their phone. So Parkinson patients also have issues with phonation as the disease progresses. And so this was able to remotely assess some of that. And then there was a spatial memory test where people were asked to tap on the screen in certain patterns, trying to remember the patterns that were lit up. Flowers were lit up on the screen. And Parkinson patients were asked, in fact, to do these as often as they wanted, but in particular, if they were taking medication, they were asked to do it both before and after medication, such that we could start to tease apart how symptoms vary based on their medication patterns. So these are the types of data that were in fact collected for each one of those tasks. So there is metadata about what type of phone was used, what type of sensors were in that phone, when the task was carried out, across all of the tasks. And then for each one of them, there were either device motion measurements, information about the touch screen and where on the screen individuals were tapping, and or readouts from the microphone. And at 6 months, what we actually this was just published earlier this month in Nature Scientific Data. We took the data from the first 6 months that were donated by mPower participants, and granting them what they had asked for. We made this data available to the research community. So we published in Nature Scientific Data not a scientific finding, but in fact all of the metadata and study descriptor about how all of the data was collected on these 9,500 or so participants. There were almost 200,000 total activities and surveys that were included in this data release. And it's our plan to continually update these data releases over time. And I think importantly, we did not publish a scientific finding. We, in fact, were focused on getting this data into the public domain, into researchers' hands as fast as possible. Ultimately trying to build a Parkinson mobile health research community that are working together to try and solve some of these very difficult issues. So here's a screenshot of the mPower Public Researcher portal on Synapse, and a bunch of the documentation that has been made available. So on the left-hand side, you can see their instructions of how to access the data, a number of different data descriptors and documentation about each one of the tasks that was out there. And then also part of this process by which we're trying to really honor the research participants. Before you get access to these data, because they are possibly sensitive in nature, there is a process that researchers have to go through, which includes an identity verification process. We're essentially requiring people to tell us who they are and what their affiliation is. We don't necessarily make any judgments on that, whether you are a high school student interested in doing Parkinson research or whether you have a PhD from Harvard. What we do try and vet is you have to have a basic understanding of how to handle possibly sensitive health information and how to use Synapse. And so there is a quiz that you have to undergo before having access to the data. And then we also require people to make a public intended data use statement. And so on this mPower Research community page, where we're trying to really seed a community of people doing this research, each individual has a public profile, a public researcher profile. We actually require that they create an ORC ID, which is a globally unique researcher identifier, and link that to their profile as well. Have a public affiliation, and then have an intended data use statement that anybody can come and see. So you can see this is an example of my intended data use statement for using these data. At this point, I checked last night, and we currently have 28 researchers just in the past 2 weeks who have gone through this process and made a public intended data use statement and now have access to these data. So we're starting to see people come together and start to take a look at these data. And ultimately, this is an attempt for us to try and promote an ecosystem where research is conducted for others to consume and not just for an individual lab or organization that is carrying out a study, really trying to build out what we oftentimes refer to as a scientific research commons. And I think we're at a point right now where this is being challenged a little bit. So this is an editorial that came out in the New England Journal of Medicine in January about data sharing. And it's my opinion that this is sort of in stark contrast to a lot of the work that we're trying to do. I encourage you actually to go take a look at this editorial. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm going to take a look at a few of the quotes from it. It's only about 4 paragraphs long, but I think it is an important embodiment of what some in the research community feel like data sharing really means. So they say that a concern that is held by some in the research community is that a new class of research person will emerge, people who had nothing to do with the design and execution of the study, but use another group's data for their own ends. I'm going to stop there just for a second and say this is something that we at SAGE, this is not a concern, this is a hope. We hope that there is a new class of research person who had nothing to do with the design and execution of a study that will come and use another group's data. Now, the end of this is something that explains why they feel like some have this concern, which is possibly stealing from the research productivity by the data gatherers, or even use to even use the data to try to disprove what the original investigator had posited. I mean, I have my own opinion about what this statement means. This is being recorded, and so I won't go into great detail as to what those beliefs are, but I'd be happy to chat with that off the record for anybody who's interested. The next sentence that comes after that is that there is concern among some frontline researchers that the system will be taken over by what some researchers have characterized as research parasites. So some of you who may be on Twitter and follow people in the data sharing space may have seen hashtags around this time around research parasites or I am a research parasite. I think that really is a concern of certain people in the research community, especially those in this case. They were talking specifically about clinical trial data sharing. And so people in the clinical trial realm oftentimes, investigators oftentimes make a good chunk of their career off of a single study and subsequent analyses that are carried out over and over again on those data sets over the span of years or tens of years after those data had been collected. And so I think there really is a concern by some in that arena that this is really going to upend their research productivity. And so whether or not you agree with the statements that came out here, in particular the research parasites, which became sort of the calling phrase that was associated with this, I actually encourage you to go read the rest of the article, because there are a lot of interesting nuggets beyond sort of the more inflammatory name calling here. But this is something that we're going to have to navigate, especially those of us who are trying to promote the data sharing mantra. So I'll just end with saying that we at SAGE, we are in fact calling all research parasites. We are encouraging this sort of behavior, and we're trying to sort of put our, we're trying to walk the walk now, as we're now generating data and not just being a consumer of data. So as we're starting to generate these mobile data, we really are trying to put it out there before we even publish our initial findings, trying to garner more eyes on the data such that insights can be captured faster, regardless of who had those insights. So with that, I'll just say thank you and happy to take any questions.